So remember a few years ago when every company in the gaming industry was telling us that Steam was terrible and Valve was terrible and the future of PC gaming was in the Epic Games Store, and with every publisher having their own distribution service and launcher? All the while, PC gamers were just sitting in their comfy chairs with a warm beverage, counting down the days until all those companies felt the consequences of their actions. Well, I am proud to announce that the day of reckoning is officially here. Not only has EA caved and started moving to Steam, not only has Activision caved and started moving to Steam, but now the big one has finally fallen. Perhaps the biggest name in this exodus from Steam was Ubisoft. Not only because they pulled out of Steam and started trying to push their own launcher, but also because they made a giant stink about how awful Valve was and how great Epic Games was, and how the Epic Games Store was the future of PC gaming. And I'll get into the details of that delicious recap in a minute, but with the launch of Far Cry 6 on Steam, I really don't think it's an understatement to say that this is officially the beginning of the end of the Epic Games Store and their horrible third-party exclusivity deals, and the end of every game company and their mother trying to succeed by simply riding Steam's coattails without understanding why Steam was successful in the first place. And as someone who's been following the Epic Games Store drama from the beginning, this shit is absolutely delicious. So make sure you have a flashlight on hand, dear viewer, because I'm about to black out the sun with the amount of shade I'm going to throw at Epic Games, at Ubisoft, and at anyone who thought this wasn't going to happen somehow. Now, I want to remind you that while the Epic Games Store is still one of the bigger distribution services on the PC, they're really only in that position because they paid for it. Epic Games used their Fortnite money to pay for a bunch of third-party exclusivity deals and try to coax people onto their service, but the countless issues with their service kept people from actually doing so. And I point this out because I feel like it's a giant misconception among non-PC gamers. It's not just that PC gamers are overly loyal to Steam or anything, it's that every platform other than Steam has massive glaring issues that go largely ignored because these platforms were born out of an attempt to cash in on the work that Steam had already done in the digital distribution market. So yes, the Epic Games Store has a ton of exclusive games and some of them are really popular, but people aren't going to the Epic Store naturally or organically because when compared to Steam, it is far less functional, far less feature complete, far less user-friendly, and a lot of the time, games are far more expensive. Steam is the superior digital distribution service because it already put in the legwork for growing its name recognition and establishing itself as a solid service for PC gamers to use. It also didn't help that during the first few years of the Epic Games Store, there were a ton of security concerns that kept people from ever trusting it. So the fact that Epic was pouring money into buying up third-party exclusives instead of using that money to beef up their own security or improve their storefront's functionality just made PC gamers at large even less likely to use it. Epic Games was publicly losing hundreds of millions of dollars a year on store operation because of this, and in this document from the Epic Games vs. Apple lawsuit, who remembers that arc? It was claimed, without opposition from Epic, that the storefront was projected to continue losing hundreds of millions of dollars a year unless there was serious change, which still has not happened. This storefront is simply not a good long-term business idea for publishers, and that brings us to today's little piece of hilarity. But to understand why Ubisoft's return to Steam is so hilarious and ironic, we have to look at why Ubisoft left Steam in the first place. Back in 2019, Ubisoft announced they were leaving Steam in favor of the Epic Games Store and their own Uplay service, which has its own laundry list of issues that can basically just be copy-pasted from that rant I went on about the Epic Store. It's slow, it's poorly optimized, it's lacking basic features that Steam has, and Uplay literally only exists because Ubisoft wanted a piece of the Steam pie without understanding why Steam worked in the first place. But anyways, Ubisoft announced in 2019 that they were leaving Steam, and they made some pretty fiery statements that have since turned the corner into irony. According to a Ubisoft spokesperson in 2019, Steam, quote, doesn't reflect where the world is today in terms of games distribution, and he called Valve's business model unrealistic.
Stop it! Oh, I'm gonna pee! Don't!
The spokesperson also claimed that, quote, it was a business decision to not put new releases on Steam and focus on the Epic Store and Ubisoft Store. Ubisoft fully supports Epic and their third-party distribution model, which is in the long term beneficial for publishers both large and indie in the video games industry. We hope this partnership helps to validate and evolve the model.
D. We were just talking.
Yeah,
and
shut
you
the
just
fuck
barged
up.
right in,
Shut
like,
the
interrupting.
fuck
We're
up.
talking nonsense.
It was like so pretentious.
Of course, the dumbest part of this entire arc was when games journalists felt the need to point out that Ubisoft games not on Steam were selling better on storefronts other than Steam. Whoa, slow down there, don't work your brain too hard. And even in the last few years, Ubisoft remained adamant that they were never returning to Steam, even flat out saying Far Cry 6 would never come to Valve's service, which is something the Steam community is having a nice hearty gut laugh about in the user reviews. The #1 most helpful review of Far Cry 6 on Steam is just a quote saying that Far Cry 6 will never be released on Steam, which was followed closely by this one, which was followed closely by this one. And I mean, it's not like Ubisoft was the only company doing this. Activision Blizzard and EA did their best to avoid Steam service, likely because of the user reviews, and they wanted to avoid those as much as they could, but as well as the ability to force people into their own PC distribution service. But Epic Games really was the worst of the bunch, because this was a company literally paying third-party developers and publishers not to release the game on the service that everyone on the PC prefers using, all the while refusing to update their storefront in a way that would make people go over there naturally. It took Epic Games literal years to introduce a shopping cart, and there is still no actual user review system on the Epic Games Store, which is why a broken-ass game like Jedi Survivor can be sitting with a 4.4 out of 5, while on Steam, it only has a 59% approval rating. Same with Last of Us Part 1, another completely broken game, has a 4 out of 5 on the Epic Store, but a 54% approval rating on Steam. And on Steam, you can actually read people's reviews and see exactly what they thought of it, while on the Epic Store, all you have to go off of is a number out of 5 that is heavily inflated in the game's favor, because the system only allows you to leave a rating after you've played the game for a certain length of time and are randomly selected by the system. The Epic Games rating system is literally designed to hide negative reception, because the only people continuing to play a broken game long enough to get one of the random review selections are the people who are not going to criticize it anyways, which is perfectly highlighted in the reviews for Last of Us and Jedi Survivor. Again, both of these games launched completely busted, which means nobody could play long enough to give a negative review on the Epic Store, and once the game was playable, or only being played by people who didn't care that they had been scammed out of their money, the random review system was only taking their reception into account on whether or not new people should buy it. Compare that to Steam's system, where anyone who owns the game can leave a review at any amount of playtime, and you can edit your review after posting it if your opinion changes or if the game changes. Just one of the million things objectively wrong with the Epic Games Store that will never be fixed, because Epic doesn't actually want to compete with Steam or push the industry forward on the gamer's behalf. They just want to cash in on the work of another company that has already done the work for them. And that brings us to Ubisoft. The deal between Ubisoft and Epic Games was pretty big. You know, Ubisoft is one of the biggest publishers in the world, and a while back they claimed that the majority of their profits came from the PC. Granted, that statement was made before they fully transitioned away from Steam, and I sure do wonder if there's any connection between those two things. So that deal should have allegedly drawn a lot of people to the Epic Games Store and to Uplay. But let me ask you, what's happened with Ubisoft over the last few years? Well, for starters, Ubisoft kicked off 2023 with an embarrassing report where they delayed Skull and Bones for the 90th time after re-revealing it just a few months prior. And this was shortly after they delayed Avatar, which is one of their only hype games in the pipeline right now. But in an early 2023 report, they stated that 2022 sales were, quote, well below expectations. They canceled 3 unannounced projects. They cut $215 million from their budget, and they kicked staffers in the face with a round of layoffs. And just a couple days ago, they started laying people off again. According to a report by Kotaku, the company lost over $500 million in the latest fiscal year, so it really shouldn't be the least bit surprising that they're now returning to the PC storefront that they previously spat in the face of. Put simply, Ubisoft literally can't afford to grandstand anymore. They can't afford to just take checks from Epic Games instead of actually growing their PC audience. Which is why when they announced not too long ago that they were returning to Steam, they had to give a week weak sauce reason for doing so that didn't actually admit that they had made a huge mistake. Because remember, they were gung-ho, guns blazing about the Epic Games Store being the future and Valve being outdated and Steam being shitty, but now when they return to Steam, all they can say is that they're, quote, constantly evaluating how to bring games to different audiences wherever they are. Which is code for, yeah, even though we talked a lot of shit about Steam's revenue share, we were still making way more money over there than we are now because people actually fucking use Steam. As it stands right now, Ubisoft is slowly bringing its games catalog back to Steam, and Far Cry 6 is currently on a fat sale on the Steam homepage, which is how I heard about this in the first place. So let this be a lesson to all game publishers that before you spit in the face of your gamers, make sure you understand why you're spitting in the first place. Nobody would have been upset with the Epic Games Store if Epic Games was doing this for the right reasons. If you were in the PC gaming scene when the Epic Games Store was announced, you'll remember that people were actually pretty excited for it. Because if something as good as Steam was getting legitimate competition, that would mean the new storefront and Steam would get even better as a response to that competition. Fuck, nobody would have even been upset if Ubisoft entirely moved to Uplay, but then beefed up its Uplay services to be on Steam's level. Because everyone benefits from competition. But when you refuse to actually compete, you cannot be surprised when we stick with what we know and what hasn't spat on us. Toodles.